It's a particular pleasure and honor for me to introduce our keynote speaker today. He's a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and author of several books and articles, numerous articles. But it's a real sort of delight for me because to me he's one of the most exciting development economists out there, and whose work I have followed for a long time. Whether it's his books, articles, or even his more popular work in more popular outlets. And to me, I really like it because I find it insightful, thoughtful, and above all, extremely well written. Right? And there is actual humor, right, in it, which you don't find in much work by economists. So in fact, I find myself quoting from his work very frequently. And today's talk that Pranab is going to give ticks all those boxes. Again, it's extremely relevant. It is topical, and it will also be insightful because corruption is a topic on which he's been working for decades and knows more about it than many others out there. And the Lokpal Act, as you all know, I am certainly keen to hear him talk about that, because as a governance solution to corruption, that in itself is extremely intriguing. And then corruption is something that has come up in recent years as a key part of the platform of many political parties, whether it is the Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi or the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf in Pakistan. And so that in itself is something that we are all looking forward to hearing. So without any further ado, Pranab.
Thank you, Kamal, for those over-generous remarks. And of course, the topic, and thank you all for coming to listen to me this lovely evening. A lot of other things to do. And thanks the organizers of the conference to invite me. Corruption has already come up in the other sessions today. And if you look at the opinion polls in India, for many years, the two topmost items of people's dissatisfaction include corruption. The other is inflation. Inflation and corruption almost invariably top the list of factors the electorate will point out. And of course, there have been several political movements in India over the decades, and most recently, of course, the last 2-3 years, the Anna Hazare movement, and then this startling rise of this basically anti-corruption party or Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi, and now nationally. I'm going to talk primarily about since it's a conference on institutions and its discontents, primarily an institutional approach to corruption associated with institutional economics, or more relevant, institutional political economy. And essentially, in that context, I'd like to suggest that some of the political movements in India are a bit over simplistic, including the Aam Aadmi Party. I find many of while I'm very grateful that they have put this on the public agenda in a way no other party has, but I find sometimes their approach a bit simplistic and of course a bit gimmicky, but since you rise so fast, you have to do gimmicks, otherwise things dissipate. All right, let me start with, what I'm going to start with is a bit of history of thought, economic thought. Corruption is something that has been talked about not just recently, for millennia in India. If you take that old book in Arthashastra, which dates back 4th century BCE. In fact, many years back, actually when I was in college, I first tried reading it. Arthashastra to me meant the Sanskrit meaning would be the text for economics, but there's very little economics in it. It's actually a treatise in public statecraft and public administration. But there's a whole chapter, almost a whole chapter on corruption. So you can imagine that even 4th century BCE, people are talking about it in quite passionate terms. And of course, in Indian ancient text, I've always noticed this. Indian ancient text, there's a fascination with numbers, numerical precision. For example, one of the paragraphs start in Arthashastra starts, there are 40 ways of embezzlement. Not 39, not 41, 40 ways. And then he goes on, 1, 2, 3 to 40. I've always noticed this, Kama Sutra, there are 64 ways of making love, and so on. But let me not digress into that. I don't have PowerPoint. I'm going to have PDF so that I can go up and down the same page. So let me start with the definition, because actually different people mean different things by corruption. Economists use it for a particular definition. I'm going to start with that. So the definition that economists use is use of public office for private gain. That immediately rules out a very large amount of corruption in most countries. Quite often corruption is inside the private sector. The big financial scams in the United States, which are connected with the crisis, largely private sector corruption. Yes, public sector gets involved when the regulators are lax, but the essential thing, and same in many developing countries, including India, a lot of corruption is strictly within or largely within the private sector. But I'm not going to talk about that tonight. There's also sometimes a confusion between size of bribe or number of transactions. People will tell you, and particularly I found foreign visitors to India often will say, oh, you just stand in a street corner, you will see the police traffic constable with one hand directing traffic and the other hand kind of extended to the passing lorry drivers who will put some coins in that other outstretched hand. But I often tell people that you are seeing numerous transactions. If you count all these up, add them, it is much less than one single transaction in Pentagon buying huge military aircrafts or whatever. That one transaction can account for a very large number of bribes. So I want us to be clear whether we're talking about size of bribe or number of transactions. There's also a distinction between corrupt and illegal. And that's, I think, something very important to keep in mind, because people use that interchangeably often. There are many things in the United States I believe are highly corrupt but legal. A great deal of political financing is, in many other countries, would be illegal, but legal in the United States, but there's no doubt it's highly corrupt. So laws in different countries are different. And so if you use illegal interchangeably with corruption, then it will be different in different countries. There is a distinction between corrupt and immoral. I'm not going to spend too much time. There's ambiguity in it. Some people say, suppose there is a political prisoner who's being tortured by the police. If you bribe the policeman not to torture that political prisoner, is that moral, immoral? There's ambiguous things there. But more importantly, there are non-monetary forms of corruption, when there may not be a direct bribe. So I give examples. When connections, not direct bribes, used to land a job or a contract. And connections, essentially what sociologists and economists now would call a gift exchange of some kind. Then another form, when a politician does you a favor, not in exchange of money, but say political support. So money is not being exchanged, yet it can be highly corrupt. Another form, when an official steals not your money, but time, through absenteeism or shirking, that also can be a corrupt form. Then there is difference between subjective perception versus objective measures. Most of the standard measures of corruption, like the Transparency International, that's a subjective measure because essentially they go around, ask businessmen about, give a country a score between 1 and 10, and that's that businessman's subjective perception. Quite often I've noticed countries which do well economically suddenly go down in the corruption index because people feel good about that country. So it's largely subjective. Economists have now started using objective measures. So for example, there's some work of Ben Olken of MIT who went around in Indonesian road projects. He found out first people's subjective perception, how much money do you think in this building, this road has been stolen? And then he actually used engineers to dig up that road, parts of that road, and make an estimate how much it would have cost and how much actually has been spent. So that's some kind of objective. There are also now several micro-surveys in economic, done by economists, asking firms, how much did you bribe? In getting this deal, how much did you bribe? Etc. So those economists are shifting now more to direct measures of corruption at the micro level, though usually from the bribe giver's point of view, which can be biased sometimes. Micro measures also give a better idea of the different types of corruption and the different implications for resource allocation. Now, corruption usually would be related to regulations and bureaucratic discretion. But policy conclusion from that is not necessarily that all you have to do is abolish those regulations. This is what quite often some of the free market wallahs will tell you. But abolition of regulation is not always a solution, particularly because we care about other outcomes. So for example, there is a control on pollution. There is a factory inspector who checks the emission from a factory, and that factory inspector is corrupt. The solution is not to abolish the job of the factory inspector, because you care about other outcomes like pollution. Depending on the primary objective, one may even argue for some tolerance for corruption in specific cases. This you will not hear any through these anti-corruption movements. People don't talk about it. Why is corruption perceived to have increased in the decades after economic liberalization in India? One of the main arguments that used to be given for liberalization is that once you get rid of the permits and licenses, you have fewer people to bribe. You don't need to bribe, so corruption will go down. The perception is that corruption has increased since then. So what are the reasons? Possible explanation. Nobody really knows the reasons, but I have some hunches. One is, of course, there's been limited liberalization in India at the state level. By state, I mean the provincial level. And the provincial level, there's a lot of things you need to go to the government. So for example, if you want to start a factory anywhere in India, you need to go to the state government for simple things: electricity connection, water connection, or before that, land. All these are potentially highly corrupt, can give rise to highly corrupt transactions. In 2012, in enforcing a contract it took on average, and these vary from state to state, it took on an average 1,420 days in Mumbai, 877 days in Chennai. Dealing with a construction permit took 258 days in Kolkata, 40 days in Bangalore. Registering property took 126 days in Bhubaneswar, 26 days in Gurgaon, and so on. So there's wide variation across regions in India. Next is an obvious point, but very important point. Over time, with economic growth, high economic growth, public resources have shot up in market value. By public resources, I mean particularly land, minerals, oil and gas fields, telecommunication spectrum. All of this have shot up in market value, particularly land, minerals, oils and gas fields have been there for a long time. But suddenly their price has gone up, so the scope for, and their political allocation generates more corruption. A third is that many, because of the subsidies in India, underpricing and diversion of things like diesel, kerosene, electricity, cooking gas, and whenever there is underpricing, there is scope for malfeasance. So for example, kerosene is subsidized for a long time in India, largely in the name of the poor. The estimates are 40 to 50% of that kerosene gets diverted in being adulterated in using for fuels in trucks and lorries. There's a big kerosene mafia in India, whose operations have sometimes led to murders. So that is another source of corruption, and these are increasing over time. And this, of course, is part of the costs of democracy, mounting election expenses in India. And this is something that one should not underestimate. In Britain, a typical MP has a constituency of about 60,000 people. A typical MP in India has to deal with about 1.3 million people. So just numbers alone will raise the costs. And of course, elections are highly fuel intensive. You need petrol. And of course, another kind of fuel you need is alcohol. And so those are very important part, and then advertisements and so on. There are talks about election reform, finance reform. I will come back to that a little later. As courts have become more clogged, normal contract enforcement become more difficult, leading to judicial corruption, particularly at the lower levels, and more settlement outside courts. Diversion of more able people to higher paying jobs in the growing private sector, having adverse effects on the composition of public sector officials. In public sector salaries, quite often the better quality people joining the private sector. So the quality of public sector officials is declining over time. With a larger role of the private sector, and PPP is private-public partnerships, which are coming in a big way in India, regulatory agencies in different fields become more important. But often weak and non-transparent regulations, and there is more scope for post-retirement officers employed in sectors formally regulated by them, open the door for corruption. This, by the way, is a problem in many countries. In fact, different countries have different name for it. United States, it's called revolving door. In Japan, it's called amakudari, and so on. I mean, this is, everybody realizes that's a major source of corruption in many countries. And this has increased because regulators are now more important than before. Public-private partnerships, particularly in infrastructure building, which is a big thing in the last 10 years in India, where collusion between business and politicians allow for rampant cost overruns and renegotiation of terms, which effectively amount to bid rigging. Because what you do, in the auctions you bid a low price and you get the contract, so you've wiped out your competitors. Once you get the contract, start the whole thing, and then there's cost overrun and then renegotiation. And this has been going on all the time. This swanky Delhi airport, you're already renegotiation. The Delhi, those who built the Delhi airport are renegotiating the price. So the original bids don't mean much. But by that time, your rivals are all wiped out. More central transfers, some of them relating to anti-poverty programs, particularly when they are not universal, can give rise to corruption. Targeting can give rise to corruption. As people know, the BPL card, the below poverty line card, now a lot of not so poor people have it, and a lot of poor people don't have it. And so there's scope for corruption there as these programs become more important. Decentralization, which has come after the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments in the early 90s, it has not gone very deep in India, but to the extent it's come, it may also lead to corruption because collusion is easier at the local level. And there's also a perception problem. When at the local level, you see people stealing much more openly than, something is happening in Delhi, who knows? You hear rumors, but you don't know. And that leads to perception of more corruption at the local level because you see more hands in the till, as it were. And this is something that is quite controversial. I have a friend who's Ashish Nandi, who's got into trouble in India, in fact was on the point of being arrested for saying something like this. Politics is over time the ethnification by, I'm using it as a general term. Hitherto subordinate groups have become politically much more assertive in India, and that's a welcome extension of democracy, widening of Indian democracy. I remember, I should tell you an anecdote. I remember in some meeting in Delhi where there were some of us academics, journalists, and some politicians were there. Next to me, seated, was quite a very well-known politician. And so somebody, and the session was on corruption. So somebody was going on and on and on about corruption. So this person next to me was getting impatient. And he told me in Hindi, he essentially said, it's all right for you upper caste people to talk about corruption. But think of this way. When you face a problem, what do? You just take the phone and call somebody. Because you know people. I don't know people. My people don't know other people in high places. So if we have money, we use money. So I call it money as a substitute for networks. And he has a point. What upper class people use networks. And that's why I said corruption is not necessarily exchange of money. It's connections. And this is very important in the case of this lower caste people. As they are rising up, quite often they have to grease their way. Otherwise they have no contacts. The other, of course, is that dignity politics sometimes trump governance. Sometimes very low rank social groups, people will vote for one of their leaders, knowing very well that leader, he or she is highly corrupt. But in other ways, he or she has brought dignity. And so there is dignity politics may trump governance. For how long, that's a different question. This is the way it started in South India, but South India now has gone on to dignity politics, has now moved on to good governance politics, not yet in North India. There's an article by Banerjee and Abhijit Banerjee and Rohini Pandey, which provide evidence to show a trade-off between caste loyalty and quality of politicians in UP between early 1980s and late 1990s in a study of over 100 electoral jurisdictions. They find that the effect of increased ethnicization on lowering the quality of politicians was stronger in jurisdictions where the demographic share of lower caste groups was larger. Let me here hasten to add something which I think was a major confusion that came up in the public discussion around Ashish Nandi's comments. And this is where I think economics is important to understand. You see, economists can say two persons are equally honest or equally dishonest. Let's assume. But yet, the two may end up in two different equilibrium, in which one is an honest equilibrium, the other is a dishonest equilibrium. It has nothing to do with the inherent honesty propensity. These are, I'm going to talk about it a little bit more a little later. It's nothing to do with the inherent honesty of a person. So somebody who's saying there is more corruption, in this case, a lower caste people, is not essentially saying that the lower caste people in general have the higher propensity for corruption. They end up, given the constraints, given the opportunities, you end up in different equilibrium. This, by the way, is true for countries. One country there's more honest, other country you see more dishonesty, doesn't mean people inherently are more honest or dishonest. Given the constraints, given the opportunities, you end up, same people may end up in different equilibrium. I think it's a very important point that economists have been trying, without much success, have been trying to press. Then with increasing education and awareness, more questions are raised about accountability, not necessarily more corruption. I would say some of the big stories on corruption in India, as I think Sanjay was suggesting about application of RTI, the Information Act brought out some of this corruption, which must have been going on earlier as well, but didn't come out but it leads to a perception of more corruption. And actually, I'm going to skip some economics here. There's a lot of literature in economics about corruption as what is called a frequency-dependent equilibrium, which means if everybody believes there is more corruption, I would also believe there is more corruption. Frequency in the sense, how many other people believe that there is more corruption. Why is that? There are models, but let me just give you some. Let me first quote Myrdal's book, Asian Drama, was quoted earlier today. There is a quotation from Jawaharlal Nehru in that book. Nehru says, merely shouting from the housetops that everybody is corrupt creates an atmosphere of corruption. People feel they live in a climate of corruption and they get corrupted themselves. The incentive to become more corrupt, for me, will be there when I know everybody else, or I think everybody else is corrupt. And there are obvious reasons. When there are more people believed to be corrupt, at the margin, the incentive for myself to be corrupt increases. For various reasons, lower reputation loss when detected. When I believe that everybody is corrupt, I don't feel that badly if I'm caught, because, well, everybody else is dishonest. Lower reputation loss, lower chance of detection when there are a large number of people who are dishonest. Lower search cost in finding a briber. I want to get a bribe, but search is risky. If you ask for a bribe and this man may be honest and get me arrested. So when I know that most people are corrupt, there's lower search cost in finding a briber. But if everybody is really dishonest and asks for bribes, competition among bribers, the size of the bribe is beat down by too many competing bribers. So ultimately it goes, and this leads to, economists have a model of this leads to multiple equilibrium. Same people can end up in different equilibria. Two otherwise similar, as I have already said, two otherwise similar countries, both in socioeconomic structures and in moral attitudes, may end up with two very different equilibrium levels of corruption. Also, initial conditions matter. A country may get, or here in this group, economists call it, or mathematicians call initial conditions, but in this group will be called history. Initial conditions matter. A country may get locked into a corrupt equilibrium, which it may find difficult to escape. I'm now going to skips some things and goes direct. In situations of widespread belief of people being corrupt, intermediates and touts have an interest in spreading cynical rumors and disinformation campaigns about officials. Again, let me tell you an anecdote. This is written up by an anthropologist in UP. He was studying UP, and he knew a particularly honest officer. But the touts will spread rumors that he's dishonest, because the touts will say, oh, he's asking for 10%. So you give me that and I'll hand over part of it and keeping my fees. Actually, he's keeping all of 10%. So it is in the interest of some intermediate agents to spread rumors and disinformation about the honesty or dishonesty of officials. In general, the presence of intermediaries, by lowering the uncertainty of whom and how much to bribe, quite often even if I want to bribe, I don't know how to bribe. But intermediaries, touts and agents make it easier. So in that sense, the cost is less. Lower the chances of detection as well as breach of corruption deals, facilitate corruption and make anti-corruption policies more difficult to implement. I think these intermediates, touts and agents, their presence is a very important part of this thing. I'm going to now skip. There is, those who are interested, there's a diagram called Schelling diagram to point to make it a little more precise. If you're interested in following this, I have a book called Scarcity, Conflicts and Cooperation. That whole book is on institutional political economy, but there is a chapter on corruption where you'll find some more details, but not on India, but in general. Now, let me talk about two different approaches you often find in the public discussion. One is a moralist approach. Oh, the morals are going to the dogs. People are not as good as they used to be. That's why corruption is increasing. And then the other is what I call fatalist. Oh, everybody is corrupt, nothing can be done. The economist approach is somewhere in between. There is a possibility of intermediate institutional economics approach. Change the incentive structure in such a way that honesty is the best policy. When as a child, the grown-ups used to tell me honesty is the best policy, I was always suspicious. They're not telling me that honesty is inherently good. They're telling me honesty is the best policy. This is exactly how economists think. Given the constraints, given that some people are dishonest, etc., what is the optimal strategy? And honesty, in some cases, can be the optimal strategy. So the economist approach is to induce those situations in which too much dishonesty is not the optimal policy. Now, one way the incentive structure includes rewards and punishments, of course. Rewards, let me start with rewards. In imperial China, under the Qing dynasty, district magistrates were paid an extra allowance, which means money to nourish honesty, which Singapore followed very logically. In Singapore, a wage premium above private sector salaries has been successful. Economists call this efficiency wage theory. Of course, very important here is that it's not just enough to give them more salary. You have to monitor much more closely. Because otherwise, if you don't monitor, but if you give me a higher salary, I will pocket the salary and also pocket the bribe. It has to be stringent monitoring and organizational changes to accompany incentive reforms. And this, by the way, has been studied in different contexts. For example, let me skip over it. It's been studied in the context of Argentinian hospital procurement of hospital supplies. It's been found that yes, giving an incentive works only if there is stringent associated with more stringent monitoring. Then comes punishment, and this is what the Hazare movement and now concentrates on. So essentially, I find the anti-corruption movements in India quite often talk about questionable morals of people and insufficient punishment. Both are important, no doubt, but they're not enough. The Hazare movement and now up concentrate on punishment of the bribe-taking official by a new bureaucracy. They want Ha-joon Lokpal with the power to investigate and prosecute at all levels of officialdom. In response, the recently enacted Lokpal Act of 2014, it became effective January 1, 2014, is a step forward in investigating and, if necessary, prosecuting public servants. This is better than the existing Prevention of Corruption Act of 1988, under which permission to prosecute has to be given by the government, even though the Supreme Court has ruled that that permission is not necessary. In actuality, quite often that permission you had to wait for that permission, which often didn't come. So the Lokpal Act is certainly an advance on that law. But there are major weaknesses of the Lokpal Act. Let me mention some. CBI, the Central Bureau of Investigation, the agency to be used by Lokpal, is not fully independent of the central government. Administratively, for example, their promotion, etc., will still depend on the politician. And not at all independent financially. The money for that office is going to be decided by some ministry. So in a sense, it's not fully independent administratively or particularly financially. So in a sense, CBI can become a political tool in the hands of some, has become actually in the hands of some politicians. Another problem is that at the state levels of provincial governments, where most common people face corrupt public officials, the powers and jurisdictions of the state level Lokpal, which is called Lokayuktas, have been left entirely to the discretion of the state legislatures. So at the state level, it's still the politicians who will decide about the powers and jurisdictions of the local Lokpals. And that obviously is subject to abuse. There are also some general issues. A super bureaucracy always raises questions like, who monitors the monitor? Or, do we have to bribe at yet another place now? Under the Lokpal Act, complaints against the Lokpal will be recognized only if they are signed by at least 100 MPs. Complaints against lower staff at the Lokpal office will be handled in-house. Both are problematic. And punishment-oriented approaches have limits. China has the severest punishment on corruption. Often, people convicted of corruption are executed. But still, there's rampant corruption in China. Then there's a problem that it's often difficult to legally distinguish beyond reasonable doubt between the outcome of simple ineptitude or administrative failures and that of dishonesty. And that's why too few people get convicted, because legally it's really difficult to establish beyond reasonable doubt whether it was just a mistake, some wrong decision, mistake, or administrative failure, or sheer ineptitude, or was it really malign intent or malfeasance? Very difficult to establish legally. Then the question, why the concentration on punishing the bribe taker and not on the sometimes wealthier bribe givers in the private sector? Because now I find Kejriwal going after Ambani's, so it's changing. But not until now, this was not much talked about. Under the Act, Lokpal's jurisdiction over the private sector is rather tenuous. But remember, I already said a great deal of corruption happens within the private sector. But the Lokpal thing is mostly about public officials. If bribe givers continue to have the opportunity to make a lot of money, they will find a way. It is thus more important to deal with the opportunities at the general level than to go for numerous punishments at the micro level. Paradoxically, an increase in punishment may even increase the size of the bribe. The bribe taker may say, now I face more risks, so you cover my risks. So bribe may actually go up. The size of the bribe may go up. Bribe takers are not always individuals. It could be a political party. And this is where, going back to the issue of reforming election finance becomes important. In fact, this is a big problem of election finance reform in India. For real election finance reform in India, political parties have to be audited. That's as simple as that. That's actually the first step. And yet, no political party in India agrees to auditing. And that's a major, major source of corruption in India. Not a single political party has agreed to their funds being audited. Even in offices, the bribe collector may not be the ultimate bribe taker. There may be an office-wide vertical network sharing in the bribe. And then I think most of the political movements against corruption do not distinguish between two essential different types of corruption. One is speed money, the standard kind where you pay an official to speed up your file. You pay him to do what he's supposed to do anyway. Russian language is much smarter than most other languages. The Russians have a specific term for that kind of corruption. And the other kind of corruption I call collusive corruption, where you pay an official to do what he's not supposed to do. The first one, what he's supposed to do anyway, but you pay to your file to be cleared faster. Here, and I would say this is the more important type of corruption. The collusive corruption is the more important, where you pay an official to do what he's not supposed to do. Many examples. And as I said, Russians have a separate term for that kind of corruption. So examples of the latter, the collusive corruption, the official connives at or looks the other way when goods are smuggled, taxes are evaded, income or property value is underassessed, driver's license or below the poverty line or food ration card is issued to unqualified people. Bids in public auctions are rigged. Lower quality materials are substituted in government procurement. So you can imagine from these examples, these are the more important cases of corruption. And in these cases, the bribe giver and the bribe taker are in some collusive arrangement. And that's why it's more difficult to root out. Because neither side has the incentive to complain. Both sides are in it, complicit in it, so neither side will complain. These cases involve collusion, etc. Neither is likely to report this to investigators. One solution, for example, in some municipal governments in India now have started doing this. So a big, in urban corruption, property assessment is that, this is very well known, the municipal assessor comes and writes down a very low value so that your taxes are lower. So now many municipalities don't depend on those assessors. They have prefixed indices in the case of property value assessment, leaving little scope for discretion on the part of the taxman. So there are some ways people are trying to handle some of the collusive corruption. Let me mention something which is historically important. This is how the zamindari system came in India. So the British rulers didn't want to bother the collection. So they subcontract the collection to these people who are called zamindars or jaigidars. So this is one way of, this is tax farming in European context. But obviously this may lead to extortion. You pay a given amount to the ultimate authority and then you extort. So there are some incentive reforms which has this problem. So there are now ways around this. In Mexico, they have done tax reform in which they have tried to stop or reduce this, an independent authority to hear appeals against extortion, for example, in overassessment in taxes, is necessary, as has been introduced as part of reforms in some countries. Similarly, corruption around decentralization, people say, give unconditional grants. It's checking for those conditions which give rise to scope for discretion and corruption. Give unconditional grants to local governments with random ex post audits. That may be another way. In general, some changes in administrative procedures may work better than erecting a new Lokpal super bureaucracy. One such change is reducing the monopoly power of the official that the client has to face. Say in getting a death certificate or a marriage certificate or a caste certificate, backward caste certificate, or a passport, wherever feasible. Now, what do I mean by reducing the monopoly power? So, simple example, in the United States, passport office, and compare that with the Indian passport office. Indian passport office, is extremely corrupt in most cases. There are a lot of touts in the passport office who will do things for you and so on. In the United States, you walk into a post office and you can apply for passport, and after some time it comes by mail. What if the passport officer asks for a bribe? You walk into another post office. So it's the competition. No single post office has the monopoly power of issuing passports. So a simple thing like that, reducing the monopoly power of the official that the clients face, can reduce a great deal of corruption. I understand the state government of Chhattisgarh has now started doing it. They've outsourced issuing of some certificates to a whole range of authorized private agencies, centrally verified with computer technology. Let me skip this. Some economists have raised some problems with this. Let me skip that. Another case of reducing official monopoly power is from the historical examples of reducing corruption in the customs office in Singapore. Singapore, after it started in middle 60s, the customs office was highly corrupt. Singapore essentially solved the problem with one big coup, one big stroke. What they did, they abolished the customs office and subcontracted the job to, I think, some Swiss or some foreign government took over the collection of customs office. So in a sense, you get rid of this whole collusive network that have developed over the years. And then after a few years, go back and so on. So it's reducing the official monopoly power, as in the customs office in Singapore, or the narcotics control section of the New York Police Department. It used to be extremely corrupt. There are many films on that, which shows the narcotics department corruption in NYPD. What they did, they introduced overlapping jurisdictions of officers. So there's competing jurisdictions. In this case, the New York NYPD case, local, state, and FBI had overlapping jurisdictions in controlling illegal drugs, which significantly reduced corruption, narcotics-related corruption in NYPD. But these agencies have to be sufficiently independent to minimize political collusion. And that's why, going back, it's important, the independence of CBI is something that's very important. A less simple but important administrative reform is to change the current system in India of bureaucratic transfers and postings, which is a major source of illicit income of politicians in state secretariats. If you go and visit any state government secretariat, you will see, very soon come to realize, that a very large part of the day of an average minister is spent not in looking at files, not in taking decisions, other decisions. It's which official will be transferred where. That's a major part of the daily activity of any minister in the state secretariats in different parts of India. And that's where a lot of money much of political funding is raised also there. Officials are prepared to pay a significant amount of money to be posted in certain jobs, in certain sectors, and certain locations. In general, and this is part of an example of a larger point about civil service reform in India. In general, career promotion for officers in India depends more on seniority than on performance. So in fact, for an IAS officer, if in the entry exam your rank was 37, that pretty much determines your whole career path, even though you turn out not to be a very good officer. So it's seniority that counts much more than performance. So an officer has the incentive to maximize his or her loot in the short period of local posting before transfer. Let me contrast this system, the Indian system, with the Chinese system. In the Chinese governance system, there's also a lot of corruption, stealing, but there's some way of compensating the local official that limits that corruption in the Chinese case. So in the Chinese promotion, career promotion of the local official, there are criteria, for example, of how fast the area you were in charge of have grown economically. So you steal, but don't steal as much as to affect the rate of growth of the local official. Whereas in India, you can steal the whole local government dry, and there's hardly any consequence. So in a sense, even though Chinese system is not democratic, they have a very simple way of limiting corruption. Chances of career promotion improve if the local area under his jurisdiction grows faster. And now they're trying to introduce environmental criteria also. Even when he steals, he takes care in his own self-interest that the general economic performance of the area does not suffer too much. And then, of course, the issue that Sanjay discussed, disclosure of information, RTI, the Right to Information Act, availability of information on local level allocations and targets, extremely important. Quite often, I've been for the last 15, 20 years, one of my major areas of research has been decentralization. I've been studying, going back to the same villages, 90 villages in West Bengal, study the local panchayats. And one simple problem, villagers don't know how much money has been allocated for a particular program. Nobody will tell them. And that, of course, to the advantage of the official. So simple availability of information. In fact, there is an article by an economist in Uganda where originally they found of the school teachers' salaries, 87% used to be stolen. And then they did the simple thing. In local radio, they started announcing the day when the money was sent, how much money was sent, etc. That drastically brought down. The simple things like that, availability of information can make big changes. And there's, of course, use of technology in tracking public supplies. So now, for example, in Chhattisgarh and a few other states have started doing it. In the public distribution of food, which is highly leaky, a lot of corruption. So they are now putting tracer. You can electronically track a given lorry carrying how much grains and delivering where. So the whole system is tracked, and that way, in some areas at least. For example, Chhattisgarh is a good example of a backward state have done tremendous improvement in public distribution of food. It used to be very backward in public distributions. In just a few years, it improved a great deal with simple reforms. One is giving local authorities more power and then checking through their technology and other sources and so on. It's made a big difference in Chhattisgarh. Similarly, computerization of land records is very, very important. and because I think, as have been mentioned before, even in the morning session about land rights, quite often, what do rights mean when you don't have land records? Again, if I may tell you an anecdote, some of you may know it. This is actually really a real thing happened in Bihar some years back. A person who used to work as a clerk in a government office in Patna, I think, he went back to his village. He thought he had some bit of land. He went back to his village. The land is no longer in his name. So when he went and complained to the local official, he said, "What happened to my land?" He just looked up and he said, "You are dead." So he said, but nothing doing. He could not prove that he's not dead. But this man is a stubborn man. So he found out that not just in that village, several other adjoining villages, there are many such dead people walking around. So he organized them and in fact called them Dead People Society and marched. Started marching. He did all kinds of things. He went to the one officer and says, "You say I'm dead, then my wife should have the widow's allowance." And so on. He went on like that. So he's a very stubborn man, got somewhere as a result of that. So land records, simple land records is a very important part. And computerization has proceeded, particularly in South India, but other parts also, making a difference. Effects of availability of audit reports. And let me report something from Brazil. Brazilian municipal elections recently, and this is a colleague of mine in Berkeley who has done this work. So they found out that the making available the audit reports of the municipalities before elections made a big difference to the elections. This is from Brazil. Let me quote something from India. So there is some work by Abhijit Banerjee and a whole group. What they did, they prepared citizens' report cards on politicians' past performance and asset and criminal backgrounds and circulated them before a municipal Delhi election. And they found significant, substantial difference in people's choosing politicians and so on. So these simple information issues make sometimes big difference. Let me now, I'm almost done. There is a special uncertainty and inefficiency of Indian corruption. I've often been told, well, you talk about corruption, but look at Japan before, China now, Korea, Taiwan, there's a lot of corruption there. And yet those countries have done very well. And this is again, if I tell you another anecdote, in a London dinner once, there was a businessman, international businessman who was there. He was talking about corruption in India. So I told him at one point, I know you have operations in Korea, Taiwan, and there's a lot of corruption there as well. In fact, in China as well as in Taiwan, I found some kind of corruption which is not there in India, at least not that I know of. Before any major surgery in the hospital, you have to bribe the doctor, which at least so far in India I have not heard. But in Taiwan and in China, it's pretty routine that you have to bring a gift to the surgeon. And yet, there is so much corruption, and yet those countries have done well. So he then answered me, this international businessman answered, and I still think he has a point. He said, yes, I know those countries are corrupt. But he says, in Korea, when I bribe somebody, I know the job will get done. In India, even after I bribe somebody, I don't know until the last moment whether the job will really get done. So I've thought about it. I call this system of multiple veto powers. Because not one person who decides. So there is another anecdote. In New Delhi, a friend called up somebody, said, could you see that my file is pushed a little faster? It's been taking ages. So he called back, looked into the file, and he calls back and says, sorry, I cannot do anything about moving your file faster. If you want me to stop a file, I can immediately do it. So it is because of the multiple veto powers. can stop. And therefore, you don't know, even after bribing somebody, whether the job will get done. This creates special uncertainty and inefficiency of Indian corruption, contrasted with corruption in East Asia. This, by the way, is also a more general point. My Korean economists friends have told me. So this goes back to the early days of Park Chung-hee, president's father. The way Park Chung-hee used to be the state developmentalism, personified, the way he used to collect money, apparently, what I've been told, is beginning of the year, he used to call all the captains of industry and told them, this is what I would like for Korea to be done. Your plans should be consistent with that, etc. And the impression he gave them is that on your way out, you see my PA. So essentially, they will promise the PA a certain lump sum contribution. And the presumption was, once you make the lump sum contribution, the rest of the year, we are not going to bother you at all. In economics, those of you who are economists here, there is a distinction between lump sum taxation and regular taxation. Lump sum taxation, economists will tell you, is more efficient because it does not affect decisions at the margin. Similarly, lump sum bribery is more efficient than the other kinds, regular routine kind of bribery, because it affects decisions at the margin, it affects allocation. So, distinction between, it's not more corruption, less corruption, more corruption in India than in East Asia. It's a different type of corruption. I think that makes a difference. Finally, and this is my final point, and this is a point that one has to keep in mind in the Indian politics today. Overzealousness in erecting a corruption detection machinery for all the good intention can stifle honest and potentially beneficial but inherently risky decisions and dynamic leadership by public sector officials. Let me again illustrate this by an anecdote. A friend of mine, when he became the CEO of a major public sector corporation, he told me, see, my hands are tied. I know the day I joined the office, there was a CBI file that was created. So they are constantly watching me. That's fine. Let them watch me. But I know the problem. So suppose there's a decision I could take decision A or decision B. Decision A is highly risky. But if it works out, the country is going to benefit enormously. Decision B is safe, but hardly any return. Okay? If I take A, which I'm tempted to, because the country is going to benefit a great deal, I know there's a chance that it will fail. Once it fails, if it fails, somebody or other in the country is going to gain from that mistake or something not working out. Somebody is going to gain. That is prima facie evidence of my corruption, because somebody is gained as a result of my decision, even though I didn't even know that person or whatever. So it's much easier for me to take the safe but very low return decision. So too much talk of corruption, I think, this is related by the way to what in Delhi you will often hear about called policy paralysis. All this talk in the last 3, 4, 5 years of corruption is having an effect on policy paralysis. So this is what I'm going to, that often works as prima facie evidence of corrupt intent of the official, and in anticipation officials often opt for less bold policies or status quo. Because there is no punishment in indecision, or hardly do anything. There's no punishment for that. But there is possible punishment and inquiry. So part of the reason of policy paralysis, and this is difficult to attract, this makes it difficult to attract talent to administration under such circumstances. So let me end by saying all this is to illustrate that corruption involves a set of complex and occasionally paradoxical institutional issues that cannot be resolved by simplistic, pious slogans. Thank you.